Imagine Berlin at night. On the surface, the city is quiet. Searchlights sweep across the concrete of the wall, border guards pace along the death strip, and Soviet officers go over reports that tell them everything is under control. What they do not see is what is happening under their boots. Beneath the border, in the wet, unstable soil of a divided city, American engineers, British spies, and young German students are carving a second Berlin, a secret Berlin of tunnels and cables, pumps and braces, microphones and cameras. On one level, it is a war of governments. The CIA and MI6 decide to dig a tunnel to tap into the Soviet Army's telephone lines, an operation so ambitious they call it Operation Gold. On another level, it is a war of individuals. Groups of refugees and students dig their own tunnels under the Berlin Wall to pull people out of East Berlin, sometimes with quiet help and money from American television networks hungry to show the world a dramatic escape. Taken together, these stories form what you might call the Tunnel of Bernauer Strasse, not a single line on a map, but a symbol for the whole underworld of American-backed ingenuity that left Soviet commanders staring at muddy holes and wondering how, once again, the West had managed to out-engineer their carefully controlled system. Tonight, you are going down into that underworld. You will hear how America built an ear under Berlin. You will see how that same culture of engineering and improvisation helped build lifelines under the wall. And you will understand why, when the Soviets tried to turn these tunnels into propaganda victories, they ended up proving exactly what they were trying to deny, that in the Cold War's invisible battles, the United States could be every bit as inventive underground as it was in the skies. Let us start with the ear. In the early 1950s, Washington had a problem. The Soviet Union had detonated its first hydrogen bomb. Red Army divisions were spread across Eastern Europe, and behind the Iron Curtain, behind the barbed wire and tanks, nobody in the West could say with confidence what the Soviets were preparing next. What the CIA and its British partners in MI6 did know was this: the communications network of the Soviet bloc ran through Berlin. Telephone and telegraph lines connecting Moscow, Warsaw, Bucharest, and key Soviet headquarters converged in and around the East German capital. Those lines were buried in the soil, strung on poles, bundled into junction boxes. If you could tap them, you could listen in on the Soviet Army's nervous system. In 1954, director Alan Dulles approved a plan that, on paper, seemed almost insane. From a U.S.-controlled sector in West Berlin, American engineers would dig a tunnel under the border into East Berlin. They would locate a crucial junction where three important Soviet cables passed just below the surface. They would cut into those cables, attach taps, and route copies of every conversation back to a secret listening post on the western side. The British had done something similar in Vienna under Operation Silver, and they brought that experience and their expertise in building listening devices to the table. The Americans brought money, equipment, and a willingness to move a truly staggering amount of dirt. Planning meetings took place in London at 2 Carlton Gardens, where CIA and MI6 officers agreed on the division of labor. The U.S. would finance and construct the tunnel, using a U.S. Air Force radar site and warehouse as a cover. The British would handle the technical side of tapping and recording the cables. The cost? Roughly $6.7 million, equivalent to tens of millions today. The codename? Operation Gold for the Americans, Operation Stopwatch for the British. From the very first day, it was as much an engineering challenge as an espionage operation. Berlin's ground is a messy mix of sand and clay with groundwater not far below the surface. Dig too shallow and you risk discovery. Dig too deep and you fight water and pressure. To solve this, American engineers designed a steel-lined tunnel built from prefabricated segments that could be assembled underground. They created a walking gallery, a narrow but navigable passage where technicians could move, pipes could run, and the cable tabs could be installed and maintained. But how do you aim a tunnel that has to cross into hostile territory without ever sending surveyors onto that territory? Here is where the American technological edge quietly came into play. High-resolution aerial photography from reconnaissance flights captured the terrain on ultra-precise glass plates. Photogrammetry specialists turn those plates into three-dimensional data, exact distances and heights down to the meter and sometimes the centimeter. At the same time, Western services used clever electromagnetic techniques, planting induction devices and other sensors near the Soviet cables to pick up their fields and estimate their positions from the safety of the West. When the math from the sky matched the readings from the ground, they knew where to dig. Two independent systems, both pointing to the same target. That's the kind of redundancy any engineer loves to see. The tunnel would stretch roughly 430 to 450 meters, close to 1,500 feet, from the American sector in Rudau to Alt-Glienicke in East Berlin. It had to be deep enough to stay hidden, but shallow enough to reach the cables, which lay only about 2 meters below the surface at the junction identified by West German intelligence. So, the Americans did what Americans do when they commit to a project. They threw expertise and hardware at the problem. They installed pumps to manage groundwater, invented new ways to stabilize sandy soil with steel and concrete, and built ventilation systems to keep the air safe for workers laboring in the dark. Every meter of advance was measured, logged, and checked against the calculations from London and Washington. After months of work, they reached the target. MI6 technicians cut into the Soviet cables, spliced in taps, and ran duplicate lines back through the tunnel to banks of recorders and amplifiers in the American sector. What happened next is one of those moments where the Cold War becomes strangely intimate. Suddenly, deep under the soil of Berlin, American and British officers could listen to Soviet and East German soldiers, officers, and officials talking to each other. They heard routine logistics calls about fuel and rations. They heard frantic conversations during alerts and exercises. They heard reports flowing between Moscow, Warsaw, and East German command posts. For 11 months and 11 days, the tunnel delivered a river of signals, over 400,000 intercepted telephone calls, plus telegraph messages, all captured on tape and transcribed for analysis. Some historians argue that the most dramatic secrets, like plans for a sudden invasion, were rarely discussed over those particular cables once the Soviets became more security conscious. But even the ordinary traffic revealed patterns, which units talked to whom, how they reacted to crises, what they considered important enough to escalate. In any case, purely as a piece of engineering, Operation Gold had proven its point. The United States and Britain had managed to tunnel under the Soviet zone of Berlin, tap into the Red Army's communications, and run a secret listening post for almost a year without being detected on the ground. Or so they thought. The twist in the story is that the Soviets had known about the tunnel from the beginning. George Blake, a British MI6 officer who had secretly become a KGB agent, had told them about Operation Gold while it was still on the drawing board. Faced with this knowledge, the KGB made a cold calculation. If they shut the operation down immediately, they would protect their communications, but they would also risk exposing Blake, one of their most valuable moles inside Western intelligence. So they chose a third option. They let the tunnel be built, they let it operate, they monitored what went over those lines, they probably adjusted their own communications to limit the damage, and in some cases to manipulate what Western analysts would hear. Only in April 1956, with Blake still undercover and the tunnel's existence ripe for exploitation, did they move. In the muddy, early hours of a rainy spring day, Soviet and East German troops rolled into a municipal cemetery in Alt-Glienicke, ostensibly to repair telephone cables damaged by water. Television crews and photographers were quietly alerted. The soldiers dug down to the cables. They discovered that the lines had been cut, spliced, and rerouted. They followed the rerouted line until they broke into a concrete and steel passage running under the border into the American sector. The Berlin Tunnel had been found. The Soviets hoped for a propaganda coup. They condemned the Americans and British in the strongest terms. They showed off the tunnel itself, the steel shell, the racks of cables, the sophisticated equipment installed underground. But something interesting happened when those images hit the Western press. Yes, newspapers and television reports noted the diplomatic scandal. Yes, editorials discussed the legal implications of tunneling into another state's territory. And yet, again and again, one theme kept coming back: admiration. Admiration for the audacity of the plan, admiration for the precision of the engineering, admiration for what one academic later called American ingenuity and expertise in solving the brutal technical problems of underground construction in such hostile conditions. Instead of being remembered only as an embarrassment, Operation Gold quickly became known as one of the most impressive intelligence operations of the early Cold War, a fact that still colors how museums and documentaries talk about it today. The Soviet attempt to shame Washington ended up, unintentionally, reinforcing a story Americans like to tell about themselves: that when they decide to build something difficult, they find a way. That story did not stay confined to the world of spies, because while Operation Gold was turning soil into a listening device, other tunnelers in Berlin were turning soil into something even more dramatic: a doorway. To understand that side of the underground war, you have to leave Rudau and Alt-Glienicke and go to Bernauer Strasse. Bernauer Strasse was one of the most haunted places on the line between East and West Berlin. The border here ran right along the edge of the sidewalk. Apartment buildings on one side were in East Berlin. The street in front of them was in West Berlin. When the wall went up in 1961, East German authorities bricked up the ground floor windows and entrances of those buildings. Residents on the upper floors jumped from windows into rescue sheets held by West Berlin firemen. Some made it, some did not. The open street and the line of buildings created a kind of theater of division, visible, dramatic, impossible to ignore. But what mattered most for the tunnelers was not the view above ground. It was the composition of the ground itself. Unlike other parts of Berlin, where groundwater rose to just 4 meters below the surface and sand made deep tunneling dangerous, the soil around Bernauer Strasse offered clay layers and a deeper water table. That meant you could dig longer, deeper tunnels before hitting water, and without immediately collapsing the street above. From West Berlin basements and courtyards, a series of escape tunnels were started here between 1962 and 1971. Most failed. A few have gone down in history. One of them is known as Tunnel 29. In 1962, a group of young West Berliners, many of them students, led by a refugee named Joachim Rudolph, decided to dig under the wall from an abandoned factory on the west side toward a target building in the east. The tunnel they envisioned would run more than 130 meters, somewhere between 135 and 155 meters, depending on the source, under Bernauer Strasse and into the basement of an apartment block on Schönholzer Strasse. They would have to deal with flooding, ventilation, and the constant risk that vibrations or subsidence would alert the Stasi. They had courage, they had basic engineering knowledge. What they did not have was money. That is where America enters the story again, this time not through the CIA, but through NBC News. 2 Italian students involved in the tunnel heard that American television networks were looking for a way to tell a dramatic Berlin escape story. They approached NBC with an offer: exclusive rights to film the tunnel in exchange for financing. NBC agreed. In a deal that would make journalism professors argue for decades, the network paid the diggers the equivalent of around $150,000 in today's money to complete their work and let NBC cameras capture it. The result was The Tunnel, a 90-minute black-and-white documentary that followed 3 West Berlin students organizing the escape of dozens of friends and family members by digging under the wall. In September 1962, after months of digging, the tunnel opened. Over 2 nights, 29 people crawled through the mud from east to west, hence the nickname Tunnel 29. The 3rd night, the Stasi moved in. There were arrests, interrogations, lives shattered. Back in the United States, NBC found itself under pressure. The Kennedy administration worried that airing the documentary would look like the U.S. government was proudly sponsoring operations that humiliated East Germany, at a moment when Washington was trying to avoid open confrontation with the USSR. For a time, the network held the film back. Then, on December 10, 1962, The Tunnel aired as an NBC white paper special. Viewers saw grainy footage of men digging by hand, of trembling refugees emerging through a trapdoor into a West Berlin basement, of the raw emotion on faces that had just passed under the wall. The program went on to win 3 Emmy Awards, including Program of the Year, the first time a documentary had ever received that honor. For American audiences, it was a revelation. This was not a story about nuclear arsenals or summit meetings. It was a story about human beings using engineering and nerve, beating one of the most oppressive systems in the world. And behind it all was an American network that, for better or worse, had used its money and cameras to make the escape possible. 2 years later, Bernauer Strasse saw another feat, Tunnel 57. In 1964, about 35 students and activists from West Berlin began digging from the basement of an old bakery at Bernauer Strasse 97 toward a courtyard toilet at Strelitzer Strasse 55. This tunnel went even deeper and longer, roughly 145 meters at a depth of around 12 meters, making it the longest, deepest escape tunnel of its time. On the nights of October 3rd and 4th, 1964, 57 people escaped through that tunnel, giving it the nickname Tunnel 57. On the 2nd night, the Stasi, tipped off, tried to storm the East Berlin exit. Shots were fired. In the ensuing chaos, border guard Egon Schultz was killed, and East German propaganda turned him into a martyr, accusing the escape helpers of murder. Only decades later, when the Stasi files were opened, did a more complicated story emerge about who fired which shots and why. Tunnel 57 was not financed by NBC or any American media outlet. It was powered by volunteer labor, small donations, and the same determination that had driven the earlier tunnelers. But it operated in a world where American media and public opinion were already deeply invested in the narrative of Berlin as a front line between freedom and dictatorship. Farther along the wall, away from the cameras, other tunnels were attempted in areas like Sacro and along Bernauer Strasse, now marked by simple information boards on the Berlin Wall Trail. They did not get Hollywood treatment, but they were part of the same underground war. When you put all of this together, Operation Gold, Tunnel 29, Tunnel 57, the lesser-known tunnels near Spandauer Strasse, you see a pattern. American power in the Cold War was not just about missiles and aircraft carriers, it was about an ecosystem of technology, media, and individual initiative that kept finding ways to exploit the blind spots of a rigid, top-down system. The Soviet and East German regimes drew the border on a map and said, "This line is closed." American engineers looked at that same line and asked, "What is the soil like under it?" American broadcasters looked and asked, "What stories are buried here?" German students looked and asked, "Where can we dig?" In Operation Gold, the answer was a steel-lined listening tube that quietly siphoned off over 400,000 Soviet conversations before anyone admitted it existed. When the Soviets tried to turn it into a public relations disaster for Washington, much of the world saw instead a testament to American and British technical skill.
In Bernauer Strasse, the answer was a series of hand-dug tunnels that carried 29, then 57 people to freedom, one of them literally financed by an American TV network that treated an escape tunnel like a documentary production. In Sacro and along Spandauer Strasse, the answer was smaller, quieter, but no less meaningful. Tunnels remembered today only by plaques along walking paths, where tourists read the word escape and try to imagine the fear and hope packed into a few meters of earth under their feet. From the Soviet side, these were all provocations and crimes, evidence of American and Western interference, proof that the enemy was willing to dig under the foundations of socialism. From the American side, they became something else. Proof that even when the big Cold War narratives were paralyzed, when tanks faced tanks at Checkpoint Charlie, when nuclear war seemed a coin flip, ordinary people, backed by clever technology and quiet support, could still move the line. If you watch this from the United States today, these stories hit a familiar emotional note. Pride at what American engineers, in partnership with allies, could build and hide under enemy territory. Fascination at the detail, the glass plate aerial photos, the custom tunnel segments, the cable taps, the pumps, the NBC camera crews wedged into West Berlin basements. Curiosity at the way this all looked from the other side, as Soviet and East German officers struggled to explain to their superiors how imperialist tunnels kept appearing under their supposedly perfect defenses. The tunnel of Spandauer Strasse as a narrative stitches these threads together into a single image. It is the image of American-backed engineering literally undermining the Iron Curtain, an ear listening to Soviet generals, a hand reaching out to East German families, a hole in the ground that the most heavily policed border in Europe could not quite seal. In World War II, Americans watched films of Sherman tanks facing off against Panthers and Tigers and drew conclusions about industry, innovation, and national character. In the Cold War, a different kind of footage played that role. Grainy images of tunnels under Berlin, CIA diagrams of underground cable taps, NBC documentaries of escapes through the dirt. They all told the same story. When confronted by big, rigid, heavily armored systems, the United States and its partners did not just build their own heavy armor, they also built ways around and under. That's why even now, a tunnel built 70 years ago still speaks so loudly. It reminds you that the real fault lines in a conflict are not just drawn on maps. Sometimes they're dug in the dark between one sector and another by people who believe that with the right tools, the right calculations, and the right amount of stubbornness, even the hardest line in the world can be moved.